the fundamental puzzle at the heart of peace science studies is why there still is conflict when there are nonviolent ways of dealing with disagreements. And there's been development in societies at an individual level, at a group level, and at an international level, ways at being able to avoid war. And nevertheless, we still see war. And one of the primary explanations that peace science and conflict scholars have come up with to try to explain this puzzle of why we see war when there's incentives to avoid it. War is costly, it is uncertain, and it is destructive to all people who participate in it. And I think, as I mentioned in the beginning, the answer and the focus we're going to have this week is money, right? How does money affect decisions at both the individual level and the group level? And I think the puzzles we're going to focus on today is grievances are everywhere, but conflict is rare. So why, if grievances are so important to understand conflict, why is war not ubiquitous, especially as relative inequality has crept up since the 1980s? So that's puzzle number one. And the researches we're going to discuss today suggest that grievances lead to action by opportunistic actors that have the resources to be able to start up the conflict and have a realistic chance of success, right? That grievances are potentially a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition to lead to conflict. And I would say greed is ubiquitous as well, right? We all have interests in having enough of this to go around to be able to take care of ourselves and our family. And so why don't we see universal war as a way to get what we want, both to satisfy grievances as well as to get more, and greed, right? Greed is clearly used by opportunistic actors in areas that have weak institutions, weak states that can't prevent them from actually doing it, or the stakes for controlling things are really high, like in areas with large natural resources. So these puzzles, right? Why are these factors important in our understanding of the relationship between economic incentives and conflict, but why it is just the start of the rest of the semester in looking at how economic self-interest interacts with other environmental or individual level factors. So in the next section, I want to talk a bit about the causes of conflict related to last week's class. And I think I showed this last week, showing the relative interest in civil conflict research in this Google Ngram viewer, which looks at published books over time to look at the relative popularity or interest in specific subjects. And as you can see, civil conflict outpaced international conflict over the entire time frame of analysis in the Google Books Ngram viewer. And in the previous week, I showed you a distribution of different forms of conflict, civil conflict, international conflict. And since the end of World War II, civil conflict has still outpaced international conflict. However, with the current Russia-Ukraine situation, as not to say that international conflict still doesn't exist. And the graph last week showed us the growth in internationalized civil conflicts, right? The war in Donbass and in Ukraine, Crimea since 2014 would be an example of an international conflict, internationalized conflict. Same with Syria. And these kind of conflicts are still relatively widespread around the world, right? And in last week, we read a literature review by Chris Blattman and Ed Miguel, summarizing a lot of the main theories of the causes of civil conflict. I'm not going to go over all of them now. I think it is a compelling read, and for my students who write literature reviews, this is an example of a compelling literature review that covers a wide swath of different causal mechanisms and summarizes them and groups them in ways that are relatively easy to understand. What I wanted to do today is summarize some of the takeaways from the workshops and the sense that I got from students' reading of the work as well as my reading of the work. This is now, 10 or 12 weeks old. but 10 or 12 years old, not weeks old, right? But it shows, I think, that first of all, good proxies for civil conflict are relatively difficult, and just social science in general. We're going to see this a bit later on today with the Collier and Hoffler article and others. This is an ongoing challenge for quantitative research and for case study research, right? Is if you have general arguments for why people do things and actually being able to go to a case or multiple cases to see how it links theory and evidence. It's always difficult to try to think about proxies for underlying theoretical arguments. A couple of other weaknesses. Idiosyncratic causes can also be important. Eric Gartsky has a paper that's now over 2 decades old, but I found it really compelling and doesn't get as much attention in a number of subfields as it should, in saying that war is in the error term, that it's really chance. It's idiosyncratic factors of each particular case that can make detecting any kind of broad comparative patterns really hard to do. And so we need to talk about the role of randomness and chance in international and domestic politics. It's quite a hard and in some ways disconcerting conclusion to reach, but I think it's important in recognizing the limitations of what we can claim about our understanding of complex social phenomena. Also, leaders can make mistakes, overestimate the chance of winning, or are just planning in the short term and not planning for the long term. There's a long history from Napoleon's estimation of how easy it would be to invade Russia in the 19th century to potentially what we're seeing now in the early days of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, international conflict, in how easy Russia might have thought it would be to fight Ukraine, and underestimating the resolve of the Ukrainian citizens and leadership. Another thing is just whether we're planning for the short term or the long term, right? Vladimir Putin is now almost 70, if he's not 70 years old now. Other leaders have stayed into power, like Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe stayed into power well into his 90s. And we're going to come back to Zimbabwe in a second. But what effect people's either individual lives or their political lives, how long they plan on being in office, could shape their incentives for action and willingness to pay costs. I think one interesting point I wanted to highlight here that Blattman and Miguel make is that economic motivations for conflict are better theorized than the psychological or sociological factors. And I think this is true, and is in large reason why I'm starting with economic causes of conflict in week 2 of this class, because the literature by Collier and Hoffler and others have been the drive towards understanding conflict was in some ways started and driven by economic causes of conflict. Political economists like Paul Collier and Anka Hoffler are in a large way responsible for our increased interest in conflict and using economic models to be able to explain it, which we're going to get to in a second. So today I want to focus on the last 2 points in this class's simplified path diagram, focus on human security, how it leads to conflict, and what goes into our understandings of human security. It's a complex phenomenon. Economics is but one part of it, and one we're going to focus on today, but it does have an important effect on people's overall level of human security. At Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right, it would be pretty low down towards the bottom. Okay. One thing that the readings that I assigned for today really doesn't dwell on, but that I wanted to mention now in our understanding of civil conflict is the greed versus grievance debate. And this had more attention 10 or 15 years ago than it does now. But I think it shaped our understanding of civil conflict, as well as the publications that came out since the 1998 article by Collier and Hoffler. And it is basically how people approach the explanations for conflict can be grouped loosely into motivations related to grievances from the 60s to the 90s, the 1960s to the 1990s. A lot of people argued that these rebellions that we saw, the anti-colonial rebellions, as well as civil wars in independent states, were driven by fundamental or historical grievances between different groups. And so this greed argument was in opposition to that, right? Then the main explanation is that economic factors motivate actors, either to maintain control of part or all of the state to control lootable natural resources, which we're going to be talking about in a couple of months in this class. Control of government assets. The public purse is usually larger than any one person's economic capacity, so you have incentives to control the government taxation or rents coming from natural resources. You can either try to break off different areas to control relatively wealthy areas. Areas of natural resources, again, come into play here. I think about in Angola or Nigeria, areas that have more of an economic capacity that might give incentive for certain people to try to seek independence. I heard Western Australia, which has a lot of natural resource production and potential for generating wealth, has thought about trying to separate. I think Texas as well. Or people could just be greedy for the benefits from ongoing war. In this class, we often focus on the start of conflict, why conflicts start. However, there is a developed literature starting in the 1990s of warlord states or predatory groups that use the lawlessness of ongoing conflicts to be able to try to benefit economically from it. So there could be benefits to just having an ongoing war that lasts for a long period of time. The average domestic, the average international war lasts less than 1 year. I think it's roughly about 10 or 11 months. Over the last 2 centuries, but the average civil war lasts over 7 years. And so these longer conflicts can provide opportunities for war economies develop. Well, contrast that is this more historical tying into people's grievances, dissatisfaction with the current distribution of power within a state or between states, or the grievances over the decisions that leaders have made. And that could lead to action. And grievances could be of a particular group within a state, either a geographic region, an ethnic group, or a political group that feels marginalized by the leadership, or it could be grievances of elites that also feel these kind of marginalized lack of access to power that they feel is their due. Now let's turn to talking about Collier and Hoffler's influential economic model of civil conflict and more general economic explanations for civil war.